Now, slaves, after you bought your slaves from the broker, they were used in domestic service as servants. And here's what the Arabs did that not even the deadly Europeans did to us, except when they were real men. They made us eunuchs. Eunuchs. So I heard somebody say, what? A eunuch means that they castrated the African black man. And these were there to guard the harems of the wealthy and the powerful. And we were also used as soldiers to fight for the Arabs. Don't look so strange. You were used as soldiers right here in the United States of America by a man called Honest Abe Lincoln. And he used you when he needed you. Fight. But we have always fought for other people. Fought to build other empires. Now, more limited use was made of African slaves in agriculture, mining, and industry than was used in the Western slave trade. And this is how the Eastern slave trade differed. The principal areas that supplied slaves for the Eastern trade, and these varied in importance over the approximately 1,250 years of the trade. Because I am saying here 1,250 years, and I want you to understand that effectively from about 1900, the African trade, the Arab slave trade went down, would decline because of the anti-slave conventions of the time. But Arabs never stopped trading in African slaves. As a matter of fact, the last legalized legalized abolition of slavery, and I'm saying legalized because I'm using the word advisedly, was in Mauritania, and this was in 1980, as late as 1980. So up to 1980, it was legal by the laws of Mauritania for Arabs to have Africans as slaves. Now, I am credibly informed, in my visit to Africa as there last year in Egypt, that slavery is still being carried on, where young blacks who go on the Hajj never return from the Hajj. They are enslaved in Saudi Arabia and transported to other parts of the Arab world still as slaves. So the Arab will not give up his fiendish ways, his love of Africans' flesh for his own purposes. Now, the regions from where the slaves came from were the coastlands of, remember now I'm talking about the Arab slave trade, were the coastlands of Kenya and Tanzania. Kenya and Tanzania, look where they were there. The coast of Somalia, higher up, yes, where the U.S. forces are now. Abyssinia, which is modern Ethiopia. Nubia, and the area between the Niger and the Atlantic coast. That's over on the other side. You see, the area between the Niger and the Atlantic coast, and a wide, huge area around Lake Chad, which is a little higher up to the right. Lake Chad, yes. And of course there you have the movement straight across the Sahara into Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria. Some people will say that Arab slavery was kinder than European slavery. That's a joke. No slave master, you have to understand something. I don't care who you are not naturally a slave. You have to be made to be a slave. When somebody catches a free man or a free woman or a free child, they don't consent to be slaves. They have to do. The thing that they all used was a thing called seasoning. That means when they get the slave first, they have to train him to be a slave. And what was the tool of training? Whip. And everybody used the whip on the African. Whether every kind of European, German, Frenchman, Italian, Spaniard, every Portuguese, everybody used the whip. And believe me, the Arabs used the whip too. Now, the cruelty of the Arabs is very well known. You see, they used to castrate you. Well, you know. Now they castrate you just without you doing anything. Now imagine when you did something to really make them mad. See? The thing about slavery in the Arab world is that the proportion of domestic slaves, house slaves, was much greater. So in a sense, because a plantation slave was okay, all right, good. I have to use these up. Domestic slavery, you don't have to use, once a slave has been broken, you don't have to use the whip, like in plantation slavery. You see, in plantation slavery, you're trying to make a man and a woman work 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 and perhaps 7 days a week. Now, you need special stimuli to make people work like that. It ain't normal. It ain't normal. See? And that's why plantation slavery was more brutal. And there was a reason why there were more domestic slaves in the Arab world. They were not used after thing. And one of the great reasons is what happened in the century. I want to get the century right here. Okay. It's the 9th century. That means a century that has the 800s in it. And it was the revolt of the Zanj. And these were East African slaves from areas that are now part of Kenya and Tanzania. And these Zanj were used by the Arabs in the 9th century to drain the salt marshes at the mouth of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, you may not, I don't think you're going to be able to see it on that map, but the Tigris and the Euphrates are up there going through Iraq and Syria there, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Yes, up there. Now the salt marsh is there. That's a tremendous job. And around Basra, if you remember the last little rumble that they had over there in Iraq, that they were fighting around Basra, and I said, that's where people stood up against the Arabs 1,000 years before. We didn't know. You had black Americans over there, African Americans in Basra, and they didn't know that it was a land of glory for a race. You see, and these slaves were being used for the preparation of land for sugar cultivation. In 868, tens of thousands of African slaves of Zanj, and most of them were a fairly recent importation. And I want to stop here. Remember Haiti? What was the thing about the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s? Recent importation of slaves from Africa. So they still had freedom, smelling freedom strong in their noses. See what I mean? Hey, when you get the Africans telling freedom strong in their nose, boy, you better watch out. And these Zanj rebelled against the conditions of their enslavement. And the rebellion was very successful initially. Now, remember what I said, they were using us as soldiers. African troops of the Caliph's Guard sent to fight them defected and joined forces with their African brothers. And the Zanj extended the area and scope of their operations, building a capital city at Al-Muqtara and another fortified town at Al-Maniya. And the classical book for this is Hunwick, and he has written, none of these books have this stuff, on black Africans in the Islamic world. Now, by 1870, they had captured the flourishing seaport of Ubula, and in 1871, they sacked Basra. This enormous slaughter. of the Arabs. Now Basra is on the border of Iraq, pretty close to Kuwait. By 1878, the major city of Wazit had been captured, and the Zanj forces were raiding within 17 miles of Baghdad, the heart of the great Arab empire. They had defeated a succession of Arab armies sent against them. So the Arabs now had to come back from all their possessions all over the Arab empire to defend Baghdad. And it was the entire Arab armies plus treachery, there's always treachery, who defeated the Zanj in 1880. They attacked the Zanj in 1880 and took 3 years to defeat them. After those tremendous battles, which almost caused the overthrow of the whole Arab empire, the Arabs never used Africans in plantation slavery again. And they learned a lesson which was passed on to the wicked white man of the West, never to put Africans of the same nation or from the same area together on your plantations, for you are certain that they are going to revolt. And that is what happened to us and why we had such difficulty in the United States and also in the Caribbean and South America, because they divided us up. In fact, the Portuguese made this mistake most of all, and that's why there were so many very powerful slave revolts in Brazil until they studied their history and corrected it. Now, I want to talk about how many. And it takes, you see, we're talking about slavery and the slave trade. And we're talking about people being slaughtered here, people being whipped to death, and all that. But how many died in the slave trade? And I'm only going to confine myself, naturally, to the Eastern slave trade, the Arab slave trade. Now, when you are looking at records to try to come to a conclusion as to how many Africans died in the Eastern slave trade, the first problem you come about is the number of areas of loss where there are no statistics available. Where would you find the documents that detail the caravans that crossed the Sahara? Now, that is not, fictitious, because those documents are somewhere, but those documents are in the hands of Arabs, or they may have been destroyed. So an African historian can't get his hands on them. Now, the European is different in that you can go to the British Marine Department or whatever it is, or the French Marine, and if you can actually look up those documents. The Europeans like to keep documents, but the Arabs are very cunning, and they don't keep documents. They ain't going, and if they keep them, they're not going to let you get them. Think about Arab dangerous people. No, even if you could get the documents, the records are never complete, because their documents will only show legal transactions. Now let us look back across the Atlantic here. Now, you know, slaves were coming in all along the time. I believe that every slave ship that came in legally and stopped in the port and went to the harbor master, and he signed up, and they checked them on the slaves in there. Oh no, a lot of those slave ships dumped their cargoes along the coast, just like you have all that good old coke coming in here now. How does it get in? Right? Prohibition. How did all the liquor, where did all the liquor come from? You're trying to stop it, but it was coming in. So there were always large number of slaves ventures that were not legal. They were off the record. Because think of it, if you're going to go to a broker in Damascus, you have to come in legally. What about the little, if you have a set of slaves that you keep outside of Damascus and you come inside and say, I got some slaves. You know? Because whenever you come into the town, you go to the broker, he has to pay a tax. Because he's in a central market. Every market that you are in is taxed. Now you want to obviate the tax on slaves, you know how to do it. Now another thing is that the historians who present the tactics have been usually white, Europeans or Arabs, and have a vested interest in minimizing the Holocaust of African people. The data is contained in records of many different Arab countries, written in a variety of languages and entered over long periods of time. Even the Arab languages change over those long periods of time. You're talking about 1,300 years. How are you going to get at those records? Well, what we do know is that African lives were lost in the following ways. Forcible capture in the home, the village or town. Men, women, and children were seized. Look at the picture, the first picture on your map. Men, women, and children. And when a mother got killed, those slave traders weren't going to take those little babies that were left and carry them across the Sahara. They just left them to die. In the process of captures, mothers and fathers were separated from their children, the children perished. Slaves, as we said, were taken as a result of wars. The march across to the Saharan border town. If you're captured in Africa, remember you have to go to this Saharan border town, somewhere across that Sahara, where you're put in those slave pens, and that's the first distance you have to travel. And that distance could be easily 100 miles, or 150 miles, through bush, dense vegetation. Now, in the slave pens, there you were waiting for the caravan. And the conditions were generally not very good. If you're penning cattle, and slaves, although slaves were very important, but you don't take care of them like you take care of your family. Then there was a journey across the Sahara, the Red Sea, or the Indian Ocean. And all of these, now here are people who have never been on a ship, if the case they're going across the Red Sea. It could be, you say, well, it's a short trip. If you're going across the Indian Ocean, it's a long trip. See? But you're going across the Sahara, that's another long trip. So you lose a lot of lives. Slaves were literally worked and beaten to death on the plantations. Well, we have to admit that there was not a large amount of plantation slavery in the Arab slave trade, and we have given the reasons why. They changed their tune after the 9th century. But before that, they were using Africans very liberally. In order to calculate the number of African lives that were lost in the Holocaust, in the Arab Holocaust, we have to work from the number of slaves that were transported across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. And the figure that I worked from was given by the Nigerian historian Inikori in the journal Tariq, which is the journal of the Nigerian Historical Society. And he came up with a figure of 10 million slaves exported from Africa during the 1250 years of the Eastern slave trade. Well, if you divide the numbers out, that figure comes out rather low. And after revision, I think that, you see, the average figure is 8,000 slaves per year. But there were periods in the Arab slave trade where the figures were way, way, way over that. You see? And 8,000 was nothing. You see, so we have to believe that this figure is a little low. And it's much more difficult to get accurate figures on the Arab slave trade as compared to transatlantic slave trade. Not to say that any of these figures are very accurate. So I use a figure of 15 million as my base figure. Now, what we can assume with great force is that for every slave, and this is, I think, is a very conservative estimate, for every slave that you land in Damascus or Baghdad or in Goa in India, you see, or in Cairo or in Tripoli, all of those border towns across the Mediterranean, remember they had to cross that Sahara. For every successfully landed there, which is what the figure talks about. They only talk about the slaves that come over. 2 slaves were lost for every one that was landed. And anybody will tell you that that is a very conservative estimate.
Right.
So right away, you're looking at 30 million. See? Now, if you look for that 1,250 years, and you think of the number of generations that you had, and how many slaves died in captivity, because slaves died in captivity by suicide, because they were simply beaten to death. The kind of work that they did was hazardous, because slaves were used in mining in the Arab world. Although they took them off the plantations, they used them in mining because they had better physical control over them in the mines. That was hazardous work. See? So you got to look at the numbers during captivity. Now, how I did it was to look at the European figures for America and South America. And what you find is that if you take the number of people coming over, you see, that were brought over in slavery, you had well over 20 million that were landed in the West. Well over 20 million. Yet at the end of slavery, if you added up all of the Africans in the Western Hemisphere, you didn't get 20 million. And I can tell you that the most slaves were in the United States of America and, of course, in Brazil. Brazil had 6 million, America had 4 million. And if you add up all the rest of the other people, see, all right, they did not come to 10 million. So how is it that you brought over 20 million and all of that time, and these people were breeding? Because remember, these people were breeding slaves. Breeding slaves was big business. The answer is that you were beating them, working them to death. Then you get the statistic that the average life of a young African stud slave on the plantations was 8 years. So, we say that if you take that total that we had, then at least that amount of people must have died over that 1250 years. So if we're looking at 15 million, right? We're saying that another 15 million died because you harassed them, beat them to death over all the generations that you had for 1,250 years. So now you're going to 45 million. Now what is the percentage that died crossing the Sahara or the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean? Remember I told you about the case where a caravan came and 1,500 died from thirst. Well, I was nice and kind and I said, if we're looking at 15 million, right? I'm saying that 20% mortality rate on the caravans. This is a better rate than was on the ships, because you know that on the ships coming across where the conditions were more hazardous, we will admit, it was as high as 25 and 30% mortality rate on those slave ships. Even the crew had a mortality rate of around 18-20%. The crew and their conditions were superior to the dense-packed Africans on board those slave ships. So that's another 3 million. So we're looking at a grand total for the Eastern slave trade of about 48 million. 48 million in the Arab slave trade. And this is the minimum. It could be very much higher than that. But for 1,250, and we can't stop at the 1,250 here because they're still enslaving us. Still enslaving us.